This video is being filmed with special permission from the publisher, Scholastic. This video is for educational read-aloud purposes only, and this video will be deleted at the end of the current 2019-2020 school year. Hello there, seekers, and welcome back to another installment of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. We're getting very close towards the end. There are 22 chapters in all, and today we are reading chapters 17 and 18. So, chapter 17 is titled Cat, Rat, and Dog. And you can see a very important picture of a very important tree there at the opening. And just as a quick recap, yesterday we read the chapter with Harry winning the Quidditch game and getting his Gryffindor house, the house cup, the Quidditch cup. Yeah, the Quidditch cup. And we also had a true prophecy, an actual accurate prediction from Professor Trelawney yesterday about how, let me go to it so that I don't mess it up. I'll summarize the prediction for you. Let me find it just real quick, guys. Because I don't want to spoil anything, but I also want to tell you what it said. Okay, so basically the prediction was, the Dark Lord lies alone and friendless, abandoned by his followers. His servant has been chained these 12 years. Tonight before midnight, the servant will break free and set out to rejoin his master. The Dark Lord will rise again with his servant's aid, greater and more terrible than ever. Tonight before midnight, the servant will set out to rejoin his master. So that was the super creepy, spooky voice prediction that Professor Trelawney made whenever Harry was last in there for his exam. And then the last thing that happened yesterday to take note of is Hagrid and poor Buckbeak lost their trial, and Buckbeak was sentenced to death, and the executioner took off his head. Very, very sad, sad ending to the chapters we read yesterday. But we're going to keep going. We're going to see what happens next with chapter 17, Cat, Rat, and Dog. So here we go. Harry's mind had gone blank with shock. The three of them stood transfixed with horror under the invisibility cloak. The very last rays of the setting sun were casting a bloody light over the long shadowed grounds. Then, behind them, they heard a wild howling. Hagrid, Harry muttered. Without thinking about what he was doing, he made to turn back, but both Ron and Hermione seized his arm. "We can't," said Ron, who was paper white. "He'll be in worse trouble if they know we've been to see him." Hermione's breathing was shallow and uneven. "How could they?" she choked. "How could they?" "Come on," said Ron, whose teeth seemed to be chattering. They set off back toward the castle, walking slowly to keep themselves hidden under the cloak. The light was fading fast now. By the time they reached open ground, darkness was settling like a spell around them. "Scabbers, keep still!" Ron hissed, clamping his hand over his chest. The rat was wiggling madly. Ron came to a sudden halt, trying to force Scabbers deeper into his pocket. "What's the matter with you, stupid rat? Stay still! Ouch! He bit me!" "Ron, be quiet," Hermione whispered urgently. "Fudge will be out here in a minute." "He won't stay put." Scabbers was plainly terrified. He was writhing with all his might, trying to break free of Ron's grip. What's the matter with him? But Harry had just seen. Slinking toward them, his body low to the ground, wide yellow eyes glinting eerily in the darkness. Crookshanks. Whether he could see them or was following the sound of Scabbers' squeaks, Harry couldn't tell. "Crookshanks," Hermione moaned. "No, go away. Crookshanks, go away." But the cat was getting nearer. "Scabbers, no!" Too late. The rat had slipped between Ron's clutching fingers, hit the ground, and scampered away. In one bound, Crookshanks sprang after him, and before Harry or Hermione could stop him, Ron had thrown down the invisibility cloak off of himself and pelted away into the darkness. "Ron!" Hermione moaned. She and Harry looked at each other, then followed at a sprint. It was impossible to full run under the cloak. They pulled it off, and it streamed behind them like a banner as they hurled after Ron. They could hear his feet thudding along ahead and his shouts at Crookshanks. "Get away from him! Get away! Scabbers, come here!" There was a loud thud. "Gotcha! Get off, you stinking cat!" Harry and Hermione almost fell over Ron. They skidded to a stop right in front of him. He was sprawled on the ground, but Scabbers was back in his pocket. He had both hands held tight over the quivering lump. "Ron, come on, back under the cloak," Hermione panted. "Dumbledore, the minister, they'll be coming in a minute." But before they could cover themselves again, before they could even catch their breath, they heard the soft pounding of a gigantic paws. Something was bounding toward them, quiet as a shadow, an enormous, pale-eyed, jet-black dog. Harry reached for his wand, but too late. The dog had made an enormous leap, and the front paws hit him on the chest. He keeled over backwards in a whirl of hair. He felt its hot breath, saw inch-long teeth, but the force of its leap had carried it too far, and it rolled off him. Dazed, feeling as though his ribs were broken, Harry tried to stand up. He could hear it growling as it skidded around for a new attack. Ron was on his feet. As the dog sprang back toward them, he pushed Harry aside. The dog's jaws fastened instead around Ron's outstretched arm. Harry lunged forward. He seized the handful of the brute's hair, but it was dragging Ron away as easily as though he were a rag doll. Then, out of nowhere, something hit Harry so hard across the face that he was knocked off his feet again. He heard Hermione shriek with pain and fall too. Harry groped for his wand, blinking blood out of his eyes. "Lumos," he whispered. The wand light showed him the trunk of a thick tree. They had chased Scabbers into the shadow of the Whomping Willow, and its branches were creaking as though in a high wind, ripping backward and forward to stop them from going nearer. And there, at the base of the trunk, was the dog, dragging Ron backward into a large gap in the roots. Ron was fighting furiously, but his legs and torso were slipping out of sight. "Run!" Harry shouted, trying to follow, but a heavy branch whipped lethally through the air, and he was forced backward again. All they could see now was one of Ron's legs, which he had hooked around a root in an effort to stop the dog from pulling himself farther underground. But a horrible crack cut the air like a gunshot. Ron's leg had broken, and a moment later his foot vanished from sight. "Harry, we've got to go for help!" Hermione gasped. She was bleeding too. The willow had cut her across the shoulder. "No, that thing's big enough to eat him. We haven't got time." "Harry, we're never going to get through without help." Another branch whipped down at them, twigs clenching like knuckles. "If that dog can get in, we can," Harry panted, darting here and there, trying to find a way through the vicious, swishing branches. But he couldn't get an inch nearer to the tree roots without being in range of the tree's blows. "Oh, help! Help!" Hermione whispered frantically, dancing uncertainly on the spot. "Please!" Crookshanks darted forward. He slithered between the battering branches like a snake and placed his front paws upon a knot on the trunk. Abruptly, as though the tree had turned to marble, it stopped moving. Not a leaf twitched or shook. "Crookshanks!" Hermione whispered uncertainly. She now grasped Harry's arm painfully hard. "How did he know?" "He's friends with that dog," said Harry grimly. "I've seen them together. Come on, and keep your wand out." They covered the distance to the trunk in seconds, but before they had reached the gap in the roots, Crookshanks had slid into it with a flick of his bottle-brush tail. Harry went next. He crawled forward, head first, and slid down an earthy slope to the bottom of a very low tunnel. Crookshanks was a little way along, his eyes flashing in the light from Harry's wand. Seconds later, Hermione slithered down beside him. "Where's Ron?" she whispered in a terrified voice. "This way," said Harry, setting off, bent back after Crookshanks. "Where does this tunnel come out?" Hermione asked, breathless from behind. "I don't know. It's marked on the Marauder's map, but Fred and George said no one's ever gotten to it. It goes off the edge of the map, but it looks like it was headed for Hogsmeade." They moved as fast as they could, bent almost double ahead of them. Crookshanks's tail bobbed in and out of view. On and on went the passage. It felt at least as long as the one to Honeyduke's. All Harry could think of was Ron and what that enormous dog might be doing to him. He was drawing breath in sharp, painful gasps, running at a crouch. And then the tunnel began to rise. Moments later, it twisted, and Crookshanks had gone. Instead, Harry could see a patch of dim light through a small opening. He and Hermione paused, gasping for breath, edging forward. Both raised their wands to see what lay about. It was a room, a very disordered, dusty room. Paper was peeling from the walls. There were stains all over the floor. Every piece of furniture was broken as though somebody had smashed it. The windows were all boarded up. Harry glanced at Hermione, who looked very frightened, but nodded. Harry pulled himself out of the hole, staring around. The room was deserted, but a door to their right stood open, leading to a shadowy hallway. Hermione suddenly grabbed Harry's arm again. Her wide eyes were traveling around the boarded windows. "Harry," she whispered, "I think we're in the Shrieking Shack." Harry looked around. His eyes fell on a wooden chair near them. Large chunks had been torn out of it. One of the legs had been ripped off entirely. "Ghosts didn't do that," he said slowly. At that moment, there was a creak overhead. Something had moved upstairs. Both of them looked up at the ceiling. Hermione's grip on Harry's arm was so tight he was losing feeling in his fingers. He raised his eyebrows at her. She nodded again and let go. Quietly as they could, they crept out into the hall and up the crumbling staircase. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust except the floor, where a wide, shiny stripe had been made by something being dragged upstairs. They reached the dark landing. "Nox," they whispered together, and the lights at the end of their wands went out. Only one door was open. As they crept toward it, they heard movement from behind it. A low moan, and then a deep, loud purring. They exchanged a last look, a last nod. Wand held tightly before him, Harry kicked the door wide open. On a magnificent four-poster bed with dusty hangings lay Crookshanks, purring loudly at the sight of them. On the floor beside him, clutching his leg, which stuck out at a strange angle, was Ron. Harry and Ron dashed across to him. "Ron, are you okay? Where's the dog?" "Not a dog," Ron moaned. His teeth were gritting in pain. "Harry, it's a trap." "What?" "He's the dog. He's an animagus." Ron was staring over Harry's shoulder. Harry wheeled around. With a snap, the man in the shadows closed the door behind them. A mass of filthy, matted hair hung to his elbows. His eyes hadn't been shining. If his eyes hadn't been shining out of the deep, dark sockets, he might have been a corpse. The waxy skin was stretched so tightly over the bones of his face, it looked like a skull. His yellow teeth were bared in a grin. It was serious black. "Expelliarmus!" he croaked, pointing Ron's wand at them. Harry and Hermione's wands shot out of their hands, high in the air, and Black caught them. Then he took a closer step. His eyes were fixed on Harry. "I thought you'd come and help your friend," he said hoarsely. His voice sounded as though he had long since lost the habit of using it. "Your father would have done the same for me. Brave of you not to run for a teacher. I'm grateful. It will make everything much easier." The taunt about his father rang in Harry's ears as though Black had bellowed it. A boiling hate erupted in Harry's chest, leaving no place for fear. For the first time in his life, he wanted his wand back in his hand, not to defend himself, but to attack, to kill. Without knowing what he was doing, he started forward, but there was a sudden movement on either side of him, and two pair of hands grabbed him and held him back. "No, Harry!" Hermione gasped in a petrified whisper. Ron, however, spoke to Black. If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too," he said fiercely, though the effort of standing upright was draining him still of more color, and he swayed slightly as he spoke. Something flickered down in Black's shadowed eyes. "Lie down," he said quietly to Ron. "You'll damage that leg even more." Did you hear me?" Ron said weakly, as though he were clinging painfully to Harry to stay upright. "You'll have to kill all three of us." "There'll be only one murder here tonight," said Black. His grin widened. "Why's that?" Harry spat, trying to wrench himself free of Ron and Hermione. "Didn't care last time, did you? Didn't mind slaughtering all those muggles to get at Pettigrew. What's the matter? Gone soft in Azkaban? Harry, Hermione whimpered. Be quiet. He killed my mom and dad, Harry roared. And with huge effort, he broke free of Hermione and Ron's restraint and lunged forward. He had forgotten about magic. He had forgotten that he was short and skinny and 13, whereas Black was a full-grown, tall man. And Harry knew, all Harry knew was that he wanted to hurt Black as badly as he could, and he didn't care how much he got hurt in return. Perhaps it was the shock of Harry doing something so stupid, but Black didn't raise the wands in time. One of Harry's hands fastened over his wasted wrist, forcing the wand tips away. The knuckles of Harry's other hand collided with the side of Black's head, and they fell backwards into the wall. Hermione was screaming. Ron was yelling. There was a blinding flash as the wands in Black's hand sent a jet of sparks into the air that missed Harry's face by inches. Harry felt the shrunken arm under his fingers twist madly, but he clung on, his other hand punching every part of Black it could find. But Black's free hand had found Harry's throat. No, he hissed. I've waited too long. The fingers tightened. Harry choked, his glasses askew. Then he saw Hermione's foot swing out of nowhere. Black let go of Harry with a grunt of pain. Ron had thrown himself down on Black's wand hand, and Harry heard a faint clatter. He fought free of the tangle of bodies and saw his own wand rolling across the floor. He threw himself forward, but Crookshanks had joined the fray. Both sets of front claws had sunk themselves deep into Harry's arms. Harry threw him off, but Crookshanks now darted towards Harry's wand. No, you don't, roared Harry, and he aimed a kick at Crookshanks that made the cat leap aside, spitting. Harry snatched his wand and turned. Get out of the way, he shouted at Ron and Hermione. They didn't need telling twice. Hermione, gasping for breath, her lip bleeding, scrambled aside, snatched up her and Ron's wands. Ron crawled to the four-poster bed and collapsed onto it, panting, his white face now tinged with green, both hands clutching his broken leg. Black was sprawling at the bottom of the wall. His thin chest rose and fell rapidly as he watched Harry walking slowly nearer, his wand pointed straight at Black's heart. Going to kill me, Harry, he whispered. Harry stopped right above him, his wand still pointing at Black's chest, looking down at him. A livid bruise was rising around Black's left eye, and his nose was bleeding. You killed my parents, said Harry, his voice shaking slightly, but his wand hand quite steady. Black stared up at him out of those sunken eyes. I don't deny it, he said very quietly. But if you knew the whole story... The whole story, Harry repeated, a furious pounding in his ears. You sold them to Voldemort. That's all I need to know. You've got to listen to me, Black said, and there was a note of urgency in his voice now. You'll regret it if you don't. You don't understand. I understand a lot better than you think, said Harry, and his voice shook more than ever. You never heard her, did you? My mum, trying to stop Voldemort from killing me? And you did that. You did it. Before either of them could say another word, something ginger streaked past Harry. Crookshanks leapt onto Black's chest and settled himself there, right over Black's heart. Black blinked and looked down at the cat. Get off, he murmured, trying to push Crookshanks off of him. But Crookshanks sank his claws into Black's robes and wouldn't shift. He turned his ugly, squashed face to Harry and looked up at him with those great yellow eyes. To his right, Hermione gave a dry sob. Harry stared down at Black and Crookshanks, his grip tightening on the wand. So what if he had to kill the cat too? It was in league with Black. If it was prepared to die trying to protect Black, that wasn't Harry's business. If Black wanted to save it, that only proved he cared more for Crookshanks than for Harry's parents. Harry raised the wand. Now was the moment to do it. Now was the moment to avenge his mother and father. He was going to kill Black. He had to kill Black. This was his chance. The seconds lengthened, and still Harry stood frozen there, wand poised, Black staring up at him, Crookshanks on his chest. Ron's ragged breath came from near the bed. Hermione was quite silent. And then came a new sound. Muffled footsteps were echoing up through the floor. Someone was moving downstairs. "We're up here!" Hermione screamed suddenly. "We're up here! Sirius Black! Quick!" Black made a startled movement that almost dislodged Crookshanks. Harry gripped his wand convulsively. "Do it now," said a voice in his head. But the footsteps were thundering up the stairs, and Harry still hadn't done it. The floor of the room burst open in a shower of red sparks, and Harry wheeled around as Professor Lupin came hurtling into the room, his face bloodless, his wand raised and ready. His eyes flickered over Ron lying on the floor, over Hermione cowering next to the door, to Harry standing there with his wand covering Black, and then to Black himself, crumpled and bleeding at Harry's feet. "Expelliarmus!" Lupin shouted. Harry's wand flew once more out of his hand. So did the two Hermione was holding. Lupin caught them all deftly and then moved into the room, staring at Black, who still had Crookshanks lying protectively across his chest. Harry stood there, feeling suddenly empty. He hadn't done it. His nerves had failed him. Black was going to be handed back to the Dementors. Then Lupin spoke in a very tense voice. "Where is he, Sirius?" Harry looked quickly at Lupin. He didn't understand what Lupin meant. Who was Lupin talking about? He turned to look at Black. Black's face was quite expressionless. For a few seconds, he didn't move at all. Then, I hope all you seekers are paying attention now, because this is where the big twist comes in. Then, very slowly, he raised his empty hand and pointed it straight at Ron. Mystified, Harry glanced around at Ron, who looked bewildered. "But then," Lupin muttered, staring at Black so intently it seemed he was trying to read his mind. "Why hasn't he shown himself before now? Unless..." Lupin's eyes suddenly widened as though he was seeing something beyond Black, something none of the rest could see. "Unless he was the one. Unless you switched without telling me." Very slowly, his sunken gaze never leaving Lupin's face, Black nodded. "Professor," Harry interrupted loudly, "what's going on?" But he never finished the question, because what he saw made his voice die in his throat. Lupin was lowering his wand, gazing fixedly at Black. The professor walked to Black's side, seized his hand, pulled him up to his feet so that Crookshanks fell to the floor, and embraced Black in a hug like a brother. Harry felt as though the bottom dropped out of his stomach. "I don't believe it!" Hermione screamed. Lupin let go of Black and turned to her. She had raised herself up off the floor and was pointing at Lupin, wide-eyed. You... Hermione? "You and him?" "Hermione, calm down." "I didn't tell anyone," Hermione shrieked. "I've been covering up for you." "Hermione, listen to me, please," Lupin shouted. "I can explain." Harry could feel himself shaking, not with fear, but with a fresh wave of fury. "I trusted you," he shouted at Lupin, his voice wavering out of control. "And all this time you've been his friend." "You're wrong," said Lupin. "I haven't been Sirius's friend, but I am now. Let me explain." "No!" Hermione screamed. "Harry, don't trust him. He's been helping Black get into the castle. He wants you dead too. He's a werewolf." There was a ringing silence. Everyone's eyes were now on Lupin, who looked remarkably calm, though rather pale. "Not at all up to your usual standard, Hermione," he said. "Only 1 out of 3, I'm afraid. I have not been helping Sirius get into the castle, and I certainly don't want Harry dead." An odd shiver passed over his face. "But I won't deny it, that I am a werewolf." Ron made a valiant effort to get up again, but fell back with a whimper of pain. Lupin made toward him, looking concerned, but Ron gasped. "Get away from me, werewolf!" Lupin stopped dead. Then, with an obvious effort, he turned to Hermione and said, "How long have you known?" "Ages," Hermione whispered. "Since I did Professor Snape's essay." "He'll be delighted," said Lupin coolly. He assigned that essay hoping someone would realize what my symptoms meant. Did you check the lunar chart and realize that I was always ill at the full moon? Or did you realize that the boggart changed into the moon when it saw me? Both, Hermione said quietly. Lupin forced a laugh. You're the cleverest witch of your age I've ever met, Hermione. I'm not, Hermione whispered. If I had been a bit cleverer, I'd have told everyone what you are. But they already know, said Lupin. At least the staff do. Dumbledore hired you when he knew you were a werewolf? Ron gasped. Is he mad? Some of the staff thought so, said Lupin. He had to work very hard to convince certain teachers that I'm trustworthy. And he was wrong, yelled Harry. You've been helping him all the time. He was pointing at Black, who suddenly crossed to the four-poster bed and sank into it, his face hidden in one shaking hand. Crookshanks leapt up beside him and stepped onto his lap, purring. Ron edged away from both of them, dragging his leg. I have not been helping Sirius, said Lupin. If you give me a chance, I'll explain. Look. He separated Harry, Ron, and Hermione's wand and threw them each back to their owner. Harry caught his, stunned. There, said Lupin, sticking his own wand back into his belt. You're armed and we're not. Now will you listen? Harry didn't know what to think. Was this a trick? If you hadn't been helping him, he said, with a furious glance at Black, how did you know he was here? The map, said Lupin. The Marauder's map. I was in my office examining it. How do you know how to work it? Said Harry suspiciously. Of course I know how to work it, said Lupin, waving his hand impatiently. I helped write it. This is very important, everyone. I'm Moony. That was my friend's nickname for me at school. You wrote... Look, the important thing is, I was watching it carefully this evening because I had no idea that you, Ron, and Hermione... Excuse me, let me reread that. Lupin said, the important thing is, I was watching it carefully this evening because I had an idea that you, Ron, and Hermione might try and sneak out of the castle and visit Hagrid before his hippogriff was executed. And I was right, wasn't I? He started to pace up and down, looking at them. Little patches of dust rose at his feet. You might have been wearing your father's old cloak, Harry. How did you know about the cloak? The number of times I saw James disappearing under it, said Lupin, waving an impatient hand again. The point is, even if you're wearing an invisibility cloak, you still show up on the Marauder's map. I watched you cross the grounds and enter Hagrid's hut. 20 minutes later, you left Hagrid and set off back toward the castle, but you were now accompanied by somebody else. What? Said Harry. No, we weren't. I couldn't believe my eyes, said Lupin, still pacing and ignoring Harry's expression. I thought the map must be malfunctioning. How could he be with you? No one was with us, said Harry. And then I saw another dot moving fast toward you, labeled Sirius Black. I saw him collide with you. I watched as he pulled two of you into the Whomping Willow. One of us, Ron said angrily. No, Ron, said Lupin. Two of you. He had stopped pacing, his eyes moving over Ron. Do you think I could have a look at the rat? He said evenly. What? Said Ron. What's Scabbers got to do with it? Everything, said Lupin. Could I see him, please? Ron hesitated, then put a hand inside his robes. Scabbers emerged, thrashing desperately. Ron had to seize his long, bald tail to stop him from escaping. Crookshanks stood up on Black's leg and made a soft hissing noise. Lupin moved closer to Ron. He seemed to be holding his breath as he gazed intently at Scabbers. What? Ron said again, holding Scabbers close to him, looking scared. What's my rat got to do with anything? That's not a rat, croaked Sirius Black suddenly. What do you mean? Of course he's a rat. No, he's not, said Lupin quietly. He's a wizard. An animagus, said Black, by the name of Peter Pettigrew. Dun, dun, dun! And that is the end of chapter 17. But we are continuing on with chapter 18, titled Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. And Seekers, just in case you don't remember who Peter Pettigrew is from earlier in the book when he was mentioned, Professor McGonagall, or one of the professors, was telling us at one point all about Harry's dad, James Potter, and he has a crew of buddies. So back whenever Harry's dad was in school, the group of buddies was James Potter, Sirius Black, Lupin, whose first name is completely escaping me right now for some bizarre reason, and Peter Pettigrew. Peter Pettigrew is the one that everyone thought Sirius Black killed whenever he murdered all of those muggles. So they thought that Peter Pettigrew had been killed by Sirius Black. So just so you know who that is. And Peter Pettigrew has also been described as kind of slow and not really as talented and smart and as good of a wizard as the other three in the group. So there's your little background knowledge. So let me keep going now with chapter 18, titled Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. And maybe now you figured out who all four of those people are. It took a few seconds for the absurdity of this statement to sink in. Then Ron voiced what Harry was thinking. "You're both mental." "Ridiculous," said Hermione faintly. "Peter Pettigrew's dead," said Harry. "He killed him 12 years ago." He pointed at Black, whose face twitched convulsively. "I meant to," he growled, his yellow teeth bared, "but little Peter got the better of me. Not this time, though." And Crookshanks was thrown to the floor as Black lunged at Scabbers. Ron yelled with pain as Black's weight fell on his broken leg. "Sirius, no!" Lupin yelled, launching himself forward and dragging Black away from Ron again. "Wait! You can't just do it like that. They need to understand. We've got to explain." "We can explain afterwards," snarled Black, trying to throw Lupin off. His hand was still clawing in the air as it tried to reach Scabbers, who was squealing like a piglet, scratching Ron's face and neck as he tried to escape. "They've got a right to know everything," Lupin panted, still trying to restrain Black. "Ron's kept him as a pet. There are parts of it even I don't understand. And Harry! You owe Harry the truth, Sirius." Black stopped struggling. As through his hollowed eye, though his hollowed eyes were still fixed on Scabbers, who was clamped tightly under Ron's bitten, scratched, and bleeding hands. "All right, then," said Black, without taking his eyes off the rat. "Tell them whatever you like, but make it quick, Remus." That's his first name, Remus Lupin. "Make it quick, Remus. I want to commit the murder I was imprisoned for." "You're nutters, both of you," said Ron shakily, looking around at Harry and Hermione for support. "I've had enough of this. I'm off." He tried to heave himself up on his good leg, but Lupin raised his wand again, pointing it at Scabbers. "You're gonna have to hear me out, Ron," he said quietly. "Just keep a tight hold on Peter while you listen." "He's not Peter! He's Scabbers!" Ron yelled, trying to force the rat back into his front pocket, but Scabbers was fighting too hard. Ron swayed and overbalanced, and Harry caught him and pushed him back to the bed. Then, ignoring Black, Harry turned to Lupin. "There were witnesses who saw Pettigrew die," he said. "A whole street full of them." "They didn't see what they thought they saw," said Black savagely, still watching Scabbers struggle in Ron's hands. "Everyone thought Sirius killed Peter," said Lupin, nodding. "I believed it myself, until I saw the map tonight. Because the Marauder's map never lies. Peter's alive. Ron is holding him, Harry." Harry looked down at Ron, and their eyes met. They agreed silently. Black and Lupin were both out of their minds. Their story made no sense whatsoever. How could Scabbers be Peter Pettigrew? Azkaban must have unhinged Black after all. But why was Lupin playing along with him? Then Hermione spoke, in a trembling, would-be calm sort of voice, as though trying to will Professor Lupin to talk sensibly. "But, Professor Lupin, Scabbers can't be Pettigrew. It just can't be true. You know it can't." "Why can't it be true?" Lupin said calmly, as though they were in class, and Hermione had simply spotted a problem in an experiment with Grindylows. "Well, because people would know if Peter Pettigrew had been an animagus. We did animagi in class with Professor McGonagall, and I looked at them up when I did my homework. The Ministry of Magic keeps tabs on witches and wizards who can become animals. There's a registrar showing which animal they become and their markings and things. And I went and looked up Professor McGonagall on the registrar, and there have only been 7 animagi this century, and Pettigrew's name wasn't on the list. Harry had barely time to marvel inwardly at the effort Hermione put into her homework when Lupin started to laugh. "Right again, Hermione," he said. But the Ministry never knew that there used to be 3 unregistered animagi running around Hogwarts. "If you're going to tell them the story, get a move on, Remus," snarled Black, who was still watching Scabbers' every desperate move. "I've waited 12 years. I'm not going to wait much longer." "All right, but you'll need to help me, Sirius," said Lupin. "I only know how it began." Lupin broke off. There had been a loud creak behind him. The bedroom door had opened on its own accord. All 5 of them stared at it. Then Lupin strode toward it and looked out into the landing. No one there. "This place is haunted." "It's not," said Lupin, still looking at the door in a puzzled way. "The shrieking shack was never haunted. The screams and howls the villagers used to hear were made by me." He pushed his graying hair out of his eyes, thought for a moment, then said, "That's where all of this starts, with my becoming a werewolf. None of this could have happened if I hadn't been bitten, and if I hadn't have been so foolhardy." He stood up, sober and tired. Ron started to interrupt, but Hermione said, "Shh." She was listening to Lupin very intently. "I was a small boy when I received the bite. My parents tried everything, but in those days there was no cure. The potion that Professor Snape has been making for me is a very recent discovery. It makes me safe, you see. As long as I take it the week preceding the full moon, I keep my mind when I transform. I am able to curl up in my office, a harmless wolf, and wait for the moon to wane again. Before the wolfsbane potion was discovered, however, I became a full-fledged monster once a month," Lupin explained. "It seemed impossible that I would be able to come to Hogwarts. Other parents weren't likely to want their children exposed to me. But then Dumbledore became headmaster, and he was sympathetic. He said that as long as we took certain precautions, there was no reason I shouldn't come to school." Lupin sighed and looked directly at Harry. "I told you months ago that the Whomping Willow was planted the year I came to Hogwarts. The truth is that it was planted because I came to Hogwarts. This house," Lupin looked miserably around the room at the shrieking shack, "the tunnel that leads to it, they were built for my use. Once a month, I was smuggled out of the castle into this place to transform. The tree was placed at the tunnel mouth to stop anyone coming across me while I was dangerous." Harry couldn't see where this story was going, but he listened raptly all the same. The only sound apart from Lupin's voice was Scabbers' frightening squeaking. "My transformation in those days were terrible. It was very painful to turn into a werewolf. I was separated from humans to bite, so I bit and scratched myself instead. The villagers heard the noise and the screaming and thought they were hearing particularly violent spirits. Dumbledore encouraged the rumor. Even now, when the house has been silent for years, villagers don't dare approach it. But apart from my transformations, I was happier than I had ever been in my life. For the first time ever, I had friends. 3 great friends. Sirius Black, Peter Pettigrew, and of course, your father, Harry, James Potter. Now, my 3 friends could hardly fail to notice that I disappeared once a month. I made up all sorts of stories, told them my mother was ill and I had to go home and see her. I was terrified they would desert me the moment they found out what I was. But of course, they, like you, Hermione, worked out the truth. And they didn't desert me at all. Instead, they did something for me that would make my transformations not only bearable, but the best times of my life. They became animagi. "My dad too?" said Harry, astounded. "Yes, indeed," said Lupin. "It took them the best part of 3 years to work out how to do it. Your father and Sirius here were the cleverest students in the school, and lucky they were, because the animagus transformation can go horribly wrong. One reason the Ministry keeps a close watch on those attempting to do it. Peter needed all the help he could get from James and Sirius. Finally, in our 5th year, they managed it. They could each turn into different animals at will. "But how did that help you?" said Hermione, sounding puzzled. "They couldn't keep me company as humans, so they kept me company as animals," said Lupin. "A werewolf is only a danger to people. They sneaked out of the castle every month under James's invisibility cloak. They transformed. Peter, as the smallest, could slip through the willow's attacking branches and touch the knot that freezes it. They would then slip down the tunnel and join me. Under their influence, I became less dangerous. My body was still wolfish, but my mind seemed to be so less wild while I was with them." "Hurry up, Remus!" snarled Black, who was still watching Scabbers with a horrible sort of hunger on his face. "I'm getting there, Sirius, I'm getting there." Well, highly exciting possibilities were open to us now that we could all transform. Soon we were leaving the shrieking shack and roaming the school grounds and the village by night. Sirius and James transformed into such large animals, they were able to keep a werewolf in check. I doubt whether any Hogwarts students ever found out more about the Hogwarts grounds and Hogsmeade than we did. And that's how we came to write the Marauders map and sign it with our nicknames. Sirius is Padfoot, Peter is Wormtail, James was Prongs. "What sort of animal?" Harry began, but Hermione cut him off. "That was still really dangerous, running around in the dark with a werewolf. What if you'd given the others the slip and bitten somebody?" "A thought that still haunts me," said Lupin heavily. "And there were near misses, many of them. We laughed about them afterwards. We were young, thoughtless, carried away with our own cleverness. Sometimes I feel guilty about betraying Dumbledore's trust, of course. He had admitted me to Hogwarts when no other headmaster would have done so, and he had no idea I was breaking the rules he had set for my own safety and for others' safety. He never knew I had led 3 fellow students into becoming animagi illegally, but I always managed to forget my guilty feeling every time we sat down to plan our next month's adventure, and I haven't changed." Lupin's face hardened. There was a self-disgust in his voice. "All this year I have been battling with myself, wondering whether I should tell Dumbledore that Sirius was an animagus. But I didn't do it. Why? Because I was too cowardly. It would have meant admitting that I'd betrayed his trust while I was at school, admitting that I led others along with me, and Dumbledore's trust has meant everything to me. He let me into Hogwarts as a boy, and he gave me a job when I have been shunned all my adult life, unable to find paid work because of what I am. And so I convinced myself that Sirius was getting into the school using dark arts he learned from Voldemort, and that being an animagus had nothing to do with it. So, in a way, Snape's been right about me all along." "Snape?" said Black harshly, taking his eyes off the Scabbers for the first time in minutes and looking at Lupin. "What's Snape got to do with this?" "He's here, Sirius," said Lupin heavily. "He's teaching here as well." He looked up at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "Professor Snape was at school with us. He fought very hard against my appointment to the Defense Against the Dark Arts job. He's been telling Dumbledore all year that I'm not to be trusted. He has his reasons. You see, Sirius here played a trick on him, which nearly killed him. A trick which involved me." Black made a derisive noise. "It served him right," he sneered, "sneaking around, trying to find out what we were up to, hoping he could get us expelled." "Severus was very interested in where I went every month," Lupin told Ron, Harry, and Hermione. "We were in the same year, you know, and we, didn't like each other very much. He especially disliked James. Jealous, I think, of James's talent on the Quidditch field. Anyway, Snape had seen me crossing the grounds with Madame Pomfrey one evening as she led me toward the Whomping Willow to transform. Sirius thought it would be, amusing to tell Snape all he had to do was prod the knot on the tree trunk with a long stick, and he'd be able to get in after me. Well, of course, Snape tried it. If he'd have gotten as far as this house, he'd have met a fully grown werewolf. But your father, who heard what Sirius had done, went after Snape and pulled him back, at great risk to his life. Snape glimpsed me, though, at the end of the tunnel. He was forbidden by Dumbledore to tell anyone, but from that time on, he knew what I was." "So that's why Snape doesn't like you," said Harry slowly, "because he thought you were in on the joke." That's right, sneered a cold voice from the wall behind Lupin. Severus Snape was pulling off the invisibility cloak, his wand pointing directly at Lupin. And that, my seekers, is where I'm going to leave you today. So you will not get to find out the full story yet of what happened that day when supposedly Sirius Black murdered Peter Pettigrew and 11 other innocent bystanders, which of course we now know didn't happen. You will not get to find out the true story just yet. You will have to wait until tomorrow when we read chapters 19 and 20, and chapters 19 is titled The Servant of Lord Voldemort. All right, guys, that's all for now. You have just sat through some of my very favorite chapters of all 7 of the Harry Potter books, and it's just going to continue to get better. These last 4 chapters we have left are pretty outstanding and more than just a little bit magical, and I can't wait to share them with you. All right, guys, that's all for now. Bye.